Sarah Martinez stood in line at the Veterans Affairs office, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the folder containing her disability claim paperwork. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the waiting area filled with other veterans, mostly men, some missing limbs, others bearing invisible wounds that showed only in their distant stares. At 28, Sarah looked younger than her years, her petite frame and soft features often causing people to underestimate her. Today was no different. As she approached the reception desk, the middle-aged clerk barely glanced up from her computer screen. "Name and purpose of visit," the woman said monotonously, her fingers already poised over the keyboard. "Sarah Martinez." "I have an appointment for a disability evaluation," Sarah replied, sliding her identification across the counter. The clerk's eyes finally lifted, scanning Sarah from head to toe with obvious skepticism. "Disability evaluation? What's your service record?" "I served in Afghanistan with the Navy," Sarah answered, keeping her voice steady despite the familiar knot forming in her stomach. A snort of laughter escaped from somewhere behind her in line. Sarah didn't turn around, but she could feel the weight of several stares boring into her back. She had experienced this reaction countless times since returning from deployment 2 years ago. The doubt, the disbelief, the assumption that someone who looked like her couldn't possibly have served in combat. "The Navy," the clerk repeated, her voice dripping with doubt. "What did you do, file paperwork on a ship somewhere?" Heat rose in Sarah's cheeks, but she maintained her composure. "I was a hospital corpsman attached to a Marine unit. I served 3 tours in Helmand province." The clerk's expression didn't change as she typed something into her computer. "Says here you're claiming PTSD and a back injury. Pretty convenient, considering those are hard to prove." Sarah's jaw tightened. She had heard variations of this conversation more times than she could count. At the grocery store when she tried to use her veteran's discount, at the bank when applying for a VA loan, even at family gatherings where distant relatives questioned her service. Being a female veteran, especially one who didn't fit the stereotypical image of a hardened soldier, meant constantly having to justify her sacrifice. "Ma'am, I have all the necessary documentation," Sarah said, her voice remaining level despite the anger building inside her. "My service record, medical reports, and statements from my commanding officers." The woman behind her in line, an older veteran with a Vietnam War cap, leaned forward. "Honey, no offense, but you look like you should be teaching kindergarten, not playing soldier." Sarah turned to face him, her brown eyes flashing. "I wasn't playing anything, sir. I saved lives in Afghanistan." "Sure you did, sweetheart," another voice chimed in from the back of the line. "Let me guess, you were a desk jockey who got scared during a rocket attack and now you want free money for the rest of your life." The waiting room had grown quiet except for the murmur of agreement from several other veterans. Sarah felt the familiar sensation of being an outsider, even among those who should understand her experiences better than anyone. She had felt this way since childhood, always having to prove herself in a world that expected her to be something other than what she was. Growing up in a rough neighborhood in East Los Angeles, Sarah had learned early that appearances could be deceiving. Her mother, Maria, worked double shifts at a textile factory while her father was deployed overseas with the army. Sarah had essentially raised her 2 younger brothers, learning to be tough when necessary but never losing the gentle nature that made her want to help others. When her father was killed by an IED during her senior year of high school, Sarah's world shattered. The military had taken the most important man in her life, but it had also shaped her understanding of service and sacrifice. Instead of turning away from the military, she felt drawn to it, specifically to the role of a corpsman where she could save lives instead of taking them. "Look, I'm going to need additional verification," the clerk said, clearly influenced by the comments from the other veterans. "Your service record seems unusual for someone with your profile." Sarah's hands clenched into fists at her sides. This was exactly what she had feared when she decided to seek help for her injuries. The physical therapy for her back wasn't working, and the nightmares were getting worse. She knew she needed the VA's support, but every step of the process felt like a battle to prove her worth. "What kind of additional verification?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she knew where this was heading. Well, we'll need testimony from other service members who can confirm your deployment history and the circumstances of your injuries, the clerk explained, consulting some unseen policy manual on her screen. Preferably from combat veterans who actually witnessed your service. The Vietnam veteran behind her chuckled. Good luck with that, honey. Real soldiers don't waste time babysitting wannabes. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, summoning the strength that had carried her through firefights and medical emergencies in one of the most dangerous regions of Afghanistan. When she opened them, her voice was steady and clear. Fine. I'll get you your proof. She turned and walked toward the exit, ignoring the continued whispers and chuckles from the waiting area. As she pushed through the glass doors into the bright California sunshine, Sarah pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the number she was looking for. The phone rang 3 times before a gruff voice answered. Martinez? That you? Hi, Chief, Sarah said, using the familiar military greeting for her former supervisor. I need a favor. Chief Petty Officer Robert Tank Thompson had been Sarah's mentor during her time in Afghanistan. A 20-year Navy veteran with arms like tree trunks and a reputation for being harder than nails, Tank was also one of the few people who had witnessed Sarah's courage under fire firsthand. What's going on, Doc? Tank asked, using the nickname all corpsmen earned regardless of their actual rank. Sarah explained the situation at the VA office, her voice cracking slightly as she recounted the humiliation she had just endured. Tank listened without interrupting, but she could hear his breathing growing heavier as she spoke. Those idiots have no idea who they're dealing with, Tank growled when she finished. Where are you now? In the parking lot outside the VA office on Wilshire. Stay right there. I'm making some calls. The line went dead, leaving Sarah standing alone beside her beat-up Honda Civic. She leaned against the car and closed her eyes, letting the warm sun wash over her face as she tried to push away the memories that always surfaced when she had to defend her service. She remembered her first day in Afghanistan, stepping off the transport helicopter into a world of dust, heat, and constant danger. The Marines in her unit had initially been skeptical of their new corpsman, especially one who looked like she belonged in a college sorority rather than a combat zone. But Sarah had quickly proven herself during her first casualty call, working calmly under fire to save a young Marine who had stepped on an IED. The memory of that day was both a source of pride and pain. She had saved Private Johnson's life, but the image of his shattered legs and terrified eyes still haunted her dreams. It was one of many incidents that had left invisible scars on her mind and soul, wounds that were just as real as any physical injury but impossible to see from the outside. 20 minutes later, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Tank, "Check your email. Then, get your ass back in there and show them what a real warrior looks like." Sarah opened her email to find a message from Tank with several attachments. As she read through the documents, her eyes widened. He had sent copies of her commendation letters, including one recommending her for the Bronze Star with V device for valor. More importantly, he had forwarded a message he had sent to every member of their old unit who was still reachable. The message was simple: "Our doc needs backup. VA office on Wilshire. 1,400 hours. Full dress if you got it." Sarah looked at her watch. It was already 1:30. She didn't know if any of her old teammates would actually show up, but the fact that Tank had reached out to them meant everything to her. These were the men she had bled with, fought alongside, and saved when they were wounded. If anyone could vouch for her service, it was them. She straightened her shoulders, tucked the folder more securely under her arm, and walked back toward the VA office. Whatever happened next, she would face it with the same courage that had carried her through 3 deployments in one of the most dangerous places on Earth. As she reached the entrance, she saw a familiar figure leaning against a motorcycle in the parking lot. Staff Sergeant Mike Bulldog Rodriguez, one of the Marines from her unit, was adjusting his dress blue uniform and checking his watch. When he saw Sarah, he broke into a wide grin. "Hey Doc, heard you were having some trouble with the paper pushers," he called out. Before Sarah could respond, she heard the rumble of more vehicles entering the parking lot. A convoy of motorcycles, pickup trucks, and SUVs was pulling in, each one carrying men in military dress uniforms or clean civilian clothes with veteran caps and patches. Sarah's heart swelled as she recognized face after face of the men she had served with. Tank climbed out of a large pickup truck and walked over to Sarah, his own dress uniform immaculate and his chest heavy with ribbons and medals.
"Ready to go back in there, Doc?" Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady.
Together, they walked toward the entrance of the VA office, followed by nearly 24 of the finest Marines and sailors Sarah had ever known. As they entered the building, conversations stopped and heads turned. The waiting area fell completely silent as this impromptu formation of veterans made their way to the reception desk. The clerk who had been so dismissive earlier looked up with wide eyes as Tank approached her counter. Behind him stood men who clearly belonged in this place, their bearing and presence unmistakably military despite their varied ages and backgrounds. "Ma'am," Tank said in his command voice, "I believe you were questioning the service record of Petty Officer Martinez here." The clerk swallowed hard and glanced between Tank and Sarah.
"Well, I just needed some additional verification."
"You'll get your verification," Tank replied, his tone leaving no room for argument.
"But, first, I think there's something you need to understand about this woman."
Tank's voice carried across the silent waiting room as he began to speak, each word carefully measured and filled with authority that came from years of military leadership. "This woman right here saved my life on 3 separate occasions," he began, gesturing toward Sarah.
"The first time was during a convoy ambush outside Marja. Our vehicle hit an IED, and I was trapped inside with a piece of shrapnel in my leg and the whole damn thing on fire."
Sarah felt her cheeks burn as every eye in the room focused on her. She wasn't comfortable being the center of attention, especially when people were talking about her actions in combat. "But," Tank continued, his voice growing stronger, "while rounds were flying overhead and the vehicle was burning, Doc here crawled through hostile fire, pulled me out, and patched me up right there in the middle of the firefight. She never hesitated, never showed fear, just did her job like the professional she is."
Staff Sergeant Rodriguez stepped forward, his own voice joining Tank's testimony. "She saved my squad leader too. Gunny Thompson caught a round in the chest during a patrol in San Jin.
Doc worked on him for 20 minutes under fire, doing chest compressions and keeping him breathing until the medevac arrived. Gunny's got 3 kids at home because of her." One by one, other members of Sarah's unit began sharing their own stories. Lance Corporal Davis talked about how Sarah had treated his infected wound in the field, preventing what could have been a life-threatening case of sepsis. Sergeant Williams described how she had talked him through a panic attack during his first firefight, keeping him focused and effective when he thought he might break. But it was Corporal Jackson's story that really captured the room's attention.
Jackson was a large African-American Marine with a quiet demeanor and intelligent eyes.
When he spoke, his voice was soft but carried the weight of absolute sincerity.
"Doc saved more than my life," Jackson began.
"She saved my soul." The waiting room was completely silent now, even the background noise from the administrative offices seemed to have stopped. Jackson continued, his eyes fixed on Sarah with obvious gratitude and respect.
"We were on patrol near the Pakistan border when our unit got separated during a firefight.
I ended up pinned down with Doc behind a low wall while Taliban fighters were trying to flank our position. I got hit in the shoulder and was bleeding pretty bad, but that wasn't the worst part." Jackson paused, gathering himself before continuing.
"I had a complete breakdown. 3 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I just couldn't handle it anymore.
I was crying, couldn't stop shaking, ready to just give up and let them overrun our position.
I was done." Sarah remembered that day clearly.
It had been one of the worst firefights of her deployment, and she had watched Jackson, one of the toughest Marines she knew, completely fall apart under the stress. She had seen it happen to other good soldiers before, and she knew it could happen to anyone. "Doc could have focused on treating my wound and calling for backup," Jackson continued. "Instead, she spent 20 minutes talking to me while bullets were flying overhead. She told me about her family, asked about mine, reminded me of all the reasons I had to make it home.
She kept me grounded when my mind was completely gone." Jackson's voice cracked slightly as he finished.
"Then, when the firefight was over and we were waiting for extraction, she never said a word to anyone about what happened. Never put it in any report, never made me feel like less of a Marine for breaking down. She just treated my wound, made sure I was okay, and acted like it never happened.
That's the kind of person she is.
The clerk behind the counter had gone completely pale during these testimonies.
Around the waiting room, other veterans who had been skeptical earlier were now looking at Sarah with new understanding and respect.
The older Vietnam veteran who had called her honey earlier removed his cap and nodded slightly in her direction.
But Tank wasn't finished yet.
He reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila folder, placing it on the counter with deliberate precision.
"Ma'am, I brought you the documentation you requested," he said to the clerk.
"These are copies of Doc's fitness reports, commendation letters, and witness statements. You'll find recommendations for the Bronze Star with V device, Navy and Marine Corps Achievement Medal with V device, and Combat Medical Badge." The clerk's hands shook slightly as she opened the folder and began reading through the documents. Sarah knew what was in there because Tank had shown her copies years earlier. The Bronze Star recommendation had never been processed due to a paperwork mix-up, something that still bothered her former unit members who felt she had been denied recognition she deserved. "There's also this," Tank continued, pulling out another document.
"A letter from Colonel Peterson, our commanding officer, specifically recommending Doc for acceptance into any advanced medical training program she chooses to pursue.
The colonel called her the finest combat medic I've had the privilege to command and a credit to the Naval Service and the United States Marine Corps."
Rodriguez stepped up beside Tank.
"Ma'am, I don't know what kind of verification you normally require, but I can tell you that every man in this room would trust Doc with their lives.
In fact, most of us already have."
The clerk looked up from the documents, her face red with embarrassment.
I
apologize for my earlier comments.
These documents clearly show."
"The documents don't show anything," Tank interrupted, his voice stern but not unkind. "They're just paper. What matters is the woman standing next to me, and the fact that she's here asking for help she earned through blood, sweat, and sacrifice." Tank turned to address the entire waiting room, his command voice carrying to every corner.
"This woman spent 3 tours in Afghanistan putting herself at risk to save the lives of American service members.
She's been wounded in combat, both physically and mentally, in service to her country. She shouldn't have to prove her worth to anyone, especially not to other veterans who should understand what service means." An elderly man in a World War II veteran cap slowly stood up from his chair in the corner of the room. His hand shook slightly with age, but his voice was strong and clear. "Son, you're absolutely right," he said, addressing Tank but looking at Sarah. "Young lady, I apologize for not speaking up earlier. I served with nurses in the Pacific, and I know firsthand how brave medical personnel can be under fire."
"Thank you for your service."
One by one, other veterans in the waiting room began standing and nodding toward Sarah.
The Vietnam veteran who had been dismissive earlier walked over and extended his hand.
"Ma'am, I was wrong to judge you. I let my own prejudices cloud my judgment, and that's not what we're supposed to be about here. Thank you for taking care of our boys over there."
Sarah shook his hand, fighting back tears. "Thank you, sir. That means a lot." The atmosphere in the room had completely transformed.
Where there had been skepticism and hostility, there was now respect and understanding. Sarah felt a weight lifting from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she had been carrying.
The clerk cleared her throat nervously.
"Ms. Martinez, I have everything I need to process your claim. Your appointment with the medical examiner is scheduled for next week, and I'll make sure all of your documentation is properly filed." "Thank you," Sarah replied, though she was looking at Tank and her former unit members rather than the clerk. As the group began to disperse, several of the other veterans in the waiting room approached Sarah to thank her personally and share their own stories of female service members they had known and respected. The Vietnam veteran, who introduced himself as Robert Murphy, told her about a nurse who had saved his life during the Tet Offensive. "She was smaller than you," Murphy said with a smile, "but she had the heart of a lion."
"Reminds me of you."
Tank hung back as the others began to leave, waiting until he was alone with Sarah before speaking. "How are you really doing, Doc?" he asked, his gruff exterior softening with genuine concern. Sarah considered lying, giving him the standard response that she was fine and adjusting well to civilian life. But this was Tank, who had seen her at her strongest and most vulnerable moments.
He deserved honesty.
Some days are better than others, she admitted. The back injury is manageable, but the nightmares, they're getting worse.
I keep thinking I should be able to handle this on my own, you know? Tank nodded, understanding.
Doc, you spent 3 years taking care of everyone else. You patched us up when we were wounded, talked us through our fears, and made sure we made it home to our families.
Now it's time to let someone take care of you.
He placed a heavy hand on her shoulder. There's no shame in needing help.
You've earned it, and, more importantly, you deserve it. Don't let anyone make you feel like you have to prove your worth ever again.
Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes.
I just feel like I should be stronger than this.
You are strong, Tank replied firmly.
You're one of the strongest people I've ever known. But strength doesn't mean carrying everything alone.
It means knowing when to accept help and support from people who care about you. He pulled a business card from his wallet and handed it to her. I'm working with a veterans organization now, helping people navigate the VA system.
You call me if you run into any more problems, okay? And, I mean any problems.
Sarah looked at the card and saw that Tank was now a patient advocate with a non-profit organization dedicated to helping combat veterans access the services they had earned. It didn't surprise her that he had found a way to continue taking care of soldiers even after his own retirement.
Tank, I can't thank you and the guys enough for what you did today, Sarah said. You don't need to thank us for anything, document.
You were there for us when we needed you, and we'll always be there for you.
That's what family does.
As Tank walked away, Sarah realized that he was right about family. The bonds forged in combat didn't end when the deployment was over or when people left the military. The men who had shown up today were her brothers in the truest sense of the word, and they had proven once again that they would never leave one of their own behind. But, as Sarah walked to her car, she knew that the real test was yet to come.
Getting past the initial skepticism at the VA was just the first step in a long process of healing and recovery.
She still had to face the medical evaluations, the therapy sessions, and the difficult work of processing her trauma and rebuilding her life. What she didn't know was that the events of today would set in motion a chain of consequences that would ultimately reveal a secret she had been carrying for 2 years, one that would shock even the men who thought they knew her complete story. The tattoo on her back told a story that went deeper than anyone imagined, and soon, the whole truth about Sarah Martinez's service in Afghanistan would finally come to light. 3 weeks after the confrontation at the VA office, Sarah sat in the waiting room of Dr. Rebecca Harrison, a trauma specialist who had been assigned to her case. The medical evaluation had gone well, and her disability claim was being processed, but Dr. Harrison had recommended ongoing therapy to address her PTSD symptoms. Sarah fidgeted with the sleeve of her jacket, nervous about opening up to yet another stranger about her experiences. She had been through several therapists since returning from Afghanistan, but none of them seemed to truly understand what she had been through. Most focused on textbook treatments and clinical approaches that felt disconnected from the reality of her experiences.
Sarah Martinez?
A woman in her 40s with kind eyes and graying hair appeared in the doorway.
That's me, Sarah replied, standing up and following Dr. Harrison into her office. The office was different from the sterile medical environments Sarah had become accustomed to.
Warm lighting, comfortable furniture, and photographs of landscapes created a welcoming atmosphere that immediately put her more at ease. Please, have a seat wherever you're comfortable, Dr. Harrison said, settling into a chair across from Sarah rather than behind a desk.
I've reviewed your file and the documentation from your recent VA visit. Quite impressive, I must say. Sarah shifted uncomfortably. I just did my job.
From what I've read, you did considerably more than that, Dr. Harrison replied gently. But we're not here to discuss your service record. We're here to talk about how you're doing now and how we can help you move forward. For the next hour, Dr. Harrison asked thoughtful questions about Sarah's current symptoms, her support system, and her goals for therapy. Unlike previous therapists,
She didn't seem to be following a script or trying to fit Sarah into a predetermined treatment plan.
"Sarah, I'd like to try something a little different today," Dr. Harrison said as their session was winding down.
"I've found that sometimes trauma can create physical tension that mirrors emotional tension. Would you be comfortable with a brief physical assessment to see if there are areas where you're holding stress?" Sarah hesitated.
She generally avoided situations where she might have to remove her jacket, but Dr. Harrison's approach had been different enough that she found herself trusting the older woman's judgment.
"What would that involve?" Sarah asked.
"Just checking your shoulders, neck, and upper back for muscle tension. You can keep your shirt on, but I'd need you to remove your jacket so I can feel the muscle groups properly."
Sarah's heart began to race.
She hadn't anticipated this request, and she wasn't sure how to explain why she was reluctant to remove her jacket without revealing information she wasn't ready to share. Dr. Harrison seemed to sense her hesitation.
"Sarah, is there something about this assessment that makes you uncomfortable? We don't have to do anything you're not ready for." Sarah took a deep breath.
Over the past 3 weeks, since the incident at the VA office, she had been thinking more and more about the secrets she was carrying. The support from Tank and her former unit members had reminded her that she didn't have to face everything alone, but there were still parts of her story that she hadn't shared with anyone. "Dr. Harrison, there's something about my service that I haven't told anyone," Sarah began, her voice barely above a whisper.
"Something that happened during my last deployment."
Dr. Harrison leaned forward slightly, her expression encouraging but patient.
"What would you like to share?"
Sarah closed her eyes and made a decision that would change everything. "I was attached to more than just Marine units during my time in Afghanistan.
For the last 6 months of my deployment, I was temporarily assigned to work with a Navy SEAL team."
Dr. Harrison's eyebrows raised slightly, but she remained calm and supportive.
"That's quite unusual for a corpsman, isn't it?" "Very unusual," Sarah confirmed.
The SEALs had lost their regular medic to an IED, and they needed someone with combat experience who could keep up with their operations. My commanding officer recommended me because of my fitness scores and my performance under fire with the Marine units." Sarah paused, gathering courage to continue. "The thing is, working with the SEALs wasn't like anything else I had experienced. These weren't regular patrols or convoy operations.
We were doing deep reconnaissance missions, direct action operations, things that were highly classified."
Dr. Harrison nodded thoughtfully.
"That sounds incredibly demanding, both physically and mentally."
It was, Sarah agreed. But it was also the most meaningful work I had ever done. The SEAL team I worked with, Team 7, was investigating human trafficking networks that were selling children to terrorist organizations. We weren't just fighting the enemy, we were trying to save innocent kids who had been kidnapped from their families. Sarah's voice grew stronger as she continued. During one mission, we raided a compound where they were holding 12 children, ranging in age from 6 to 14. The intelligence said the kids were going to be moved the next day to training camps where they would be turned into suicide bombers. Dr. Harrison's professional composure remained steady, but Sarah could see the emotion in her eyes. That must have been incredibly difficult to witness. "The raid went perfectly," Sarah continued. "We got in, neutralized the guards, and secured the children. But one of the kids, a little girl named Amara, had been severely beaten and was in critical condition. She had internal bleeding and wouldn't have survived the helicopter ride to the field hospital."
Sarah's hands began to shake as she recalled that night.
"I had to perform emergency surgery in a bombed-out building with improvised equipment while the rest of the team provided security. I operated on a 10-year-old girl by flashlight for 3 hours, using techniques I had never been taught in corpsman training."
"Did she survive?"
Dr. Harrison asked softly. "She did," Sarah replied, a tear rolling down her cheek. "Not only did she survive, but she made a full recovery." The SEAL team leader, Lieutenant Commander Marcus Stone, said it was the most incredible thing he had ever witnessed. He said I had saved that little girl's life through pure skill and determination. Sarah wiped her eyes and continued. "When we got back to base, Commander Stone told me that what I had done went beyond normal medical treatment. He said I had shown the kind of courage and skill that exemplified everything the SEALs stood for. Dr. Harrison waited patiently as Sarah gathered herself to continue. The night before I was supposed to rotate back to my Marine unit, the entire SEAL team held a ceremony. They said that even though I wasn't technically a SEAL, I had earned their respect and brotherhood through my actions. Commander Stone asked if I would accept an honorary recognition of my service with their team. Sarah stood up slowly and turned her back to Dr. Harrison. With trembling hands, she removed her jacket and pulled up her shirt to reveal her upper back. Dr. Harrison gasped softly at what she saw.
Across Sarah's shoulder blades was an intricate tattoo of the Navy SEAL trident, but this wasn't just any SEAL insignia.
Incorporated into the design were the names of all 12 children they had rescued, written in elegant script around the wings of the eagle. Below the trident, in bold letters, were the words Honorary Sister, Team 7. But what made the tattoo truly extraordinary was the addition at the bottom. In Commander Stone's own handwriting, reproduced perfectly by the tattoo artist, were the words for courage beyond measure and compassion beyond compare. The entire team signed off on it, Sarah explained, her voice filled with emotion. They said that even though regulations prevented them from making me an official SEAL, this was their way of acknowledging that I was one of them. Commander Stone personally designed the tattoo and arranged for it to be done by an artist who had security clearance to work on the base. Dr. Harrison was speechless for several moments. In her years of working with veterans, she had never seen anything like this. The SEAL community was notoriously exclusive, and for them to grant this kind of recognition to an outsider was virtually unprecedented. Sarah, this is remarkable, Dr. Harrison finally said. Why haven't you shared this with anyone else? Sarah pulled her shirt down and turned back around. Because it wasn't about recognition or glory. It was about those children and doing what was right. The mission itself is still classified, and I wasn't sure if I was even allowed to talk about the tattoo or what it meant. But, more than that, Sarah continued, I was afraid people wouldn't believe me. If they questioned my basic service as a corpsman, how could I expect them to believe that I had worked with SEALs and earned this kind of honor? Dr. Harrison nodded, understanding. You've been carrying this secret for 2 years? Yes. Even Tank and the other Marines from my unit don't know about my assignment with Team 7. It happened after most of them had rotated home. Dr. Harrison leaned back in her chair, processing everything Sarah had shared. Sarah, I think it's time you stopped hiding this part of your story. What you accomplished, both medically and as a human being, is extraordinary. The fact that a SEAL team honored you in this way speaks to something remarkable about your character and your service. But what if people think I'm making it up? Sarah asked. Then, they're not the right people to have in your life, Dr. Harrison replied firmly. Sarah, you've been minimizing your achievements and hiding your most meaningful experiences because you're afraid of judgment from people who don't understand what real service looks like. Dr. Harrison stood up and walked over to her bookshelf, pulling out a thick folder. I want to show you something. She opened the folder to reveal newspaper clippings, photographs, and official documents. I've been treating veterans for 15 years, and I've learned to research the units and operations my patients were involved in. It helps me understand their experiences better. She pulled out a declassified mission report and handed it to Sarah. This is from Operation Guardian Angel, a series of missions focused on disrupting human trafficking networks in Afghanistan. The report mentions the rescue of 12 children from a compound near the Pakistan border and specifically commends the actions of an unnamed Navy corpsman. Sarah's hands shook as she read the report. It was her mission, described in official language but unmistakably the same operation where she had saved Amara's life. The report concludes, Dr. Harrison continued, by stating that the corpsman's actions were instrumental in the success of the mission and recommending that individual for the Navy Cross, the second highest decoration for valor in the Navy. Sarah looked up in shock. I never received a Navy Cross. Because the mission was classified and your role couldn't be publicly acknowledged, Dr. Harrison explained. But the recommendation is in your official file. I suspect that SEAL Team Tattoo was their way of giving you the recognition you deserved but couldn't receive through official channels. Dr.
Harrison sat back down across from Sarah.
Sarah, you're not just a veteran struggling with PTSD. You're a genuine hero who has been hiding her light under a bushel because she's afraid of what people might think. It's time to stop being ashamed of your extraordinary service and start embracing the warrior you are. Sarah felt a weight lifting from her shoulders that had been there for years. For the first time since returning from Afghanistan, she felt proud of what she had accomplished instead of guilty about what she couldn't save or fix.
What do I do now? Sarah asked.
You start living like the hero you are, Dr. Harrison replied. You continue your therapy, you accept the help you've earned, and you stop apologizing for taking up space in this world. Most importantly, you consider sharing your full story with people who matter to you. As Sarah left Dr. Harrison's office that day, she felt different. The secret she had carried for 2 years was no longer a burden but a source of strength. The tattoo on her back wasn't just ink and skin, it was a testament to her courage, skill, and compassion. 2 months later, Sarah stood once again at the VA office, but this time she wasn't there for herself. She was there as a volunteer, helping other female veterans navigate the system and advocating for those who were facing the same skepticism she had encountered. When Tank walked in and saw her behind the information desk, he broke into a wide grin.
Hey Doc, what are you doing here?
Sarah smiled back and stood up, turning around and lifting the back of her shirt slightly to reveal just the top edge of the SEAL Trident tattoo.
Tank's eyes widened as he saw the distinctive insignia. Doc, is that what I think it is? He asked in amazement.
There's a lot about my last deployment that I never told you guys, Sarah replied with a smile. But I think it's time you heard the whole story. As Tank stared at the tattoo, a Navy SEAL who had been waiting in line approached the desk. He was a young petty officer, probably in his mid-20s, with the confident bearing that all SEALs seem to possess. When he saw the edge of the tattoo visible above Sarah's collar, his entire demeanor changed. He straightened to attention and, to the amazement of everyone in the waiting room, rendered a perfect military salute. "Ma'am, Petty Officer 2nd Class Martinez, Team 7, he asked, his voice filled with respect. Sarah returned the salute, no longer ashamed of her service or afraid of the recognition she had earned.
That's correct, Petty Officer. Ma'am, it's an honor to meet you. Your story is legend in the teams.
What you did for those kids, what you accomplished with Team 7, every SEAL knows about the corpsman who earned the Trident." Around the waiting room, conversations stopped as people realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. The skeptical looks that had greeted Sarah months earlier were replaced by expressions of awe and respect. Sarah Martinez was no longer hiding her light under a bushel. She was standing tall, proud of her service, and ready to help other veterans claim the recognition and support they deserved. The tattoo on her back told a story of courage, compassion, and brotherhood that transcended traditional military boundaries. And, for the first time since returning from Afghanistan, Sarah felt like she was truly home.